This tiny $200 ultra-wide prime from Viltrox might just be instrumental to a photographer starting out. In this video, let's talk about the all-new Viltrox 14mm f4 Air for full-frame mirrorless cameras. Now, I'm really not exaggerating this. This lens doesn't really seem like much if you're gonna look at the numbers. It's a 14mm f4. And a lot of photographers are going to be thinking, well, it's f4. It's not f2.8, it's not f1.8, or any faster aperture. And if you were wishing for that kind of aperture, then obviously you're not the target market for this lens. But if you do hear me out, and if you're someone who is starting out, especially if you're someone starting out who shoots the same things as I do, this is actually the kind of lens that I wish existed when I was starting out. It's a 14mm ultra wide angle. It's wider than the usual 16mm for full frame. It's f4 and I don't care. Even if this came in at f8, I wouldn't care because I always shoot not wide open. For those of you who are new to the channel, I'm a landscape photographer, I'm an architectural photographer, in both those genres, except for when you're shooting with the night sky. You will always be shooting with an aperture around f8, f11, f16. So when I was starting out, whether I would be shooting landscapes or whether I would be shooting interiors, I really would have no use for f2.8 or for f1.8 or anything like that. And since I was starting out, I wouldn't have much budget for lenses. This coming in at $200 would have been literally a lifesaver because I wouldn't have to spend on the very expensive lenses. But of course, there will be a lot to talk about that because then you would have to consider the costs and if the costs would be worth the quality. And that's really what we're going to be talking about that. But before that, let's talk about the lens itself. So again, this is the 14mm f4 Air, and if you are familiar with the lenses from Viltrox, the Air line is basically their budget line and also their lightweight line. That's why this lens is just 190 grams. That already includes the caps and even the lens hood. And it only is 2.4 inches long and 2.5 inches wide. It's compact, it's lightweight, and that is why it's called Air. Now, if you're thinking about architectural photography or interiors, then it wouldn't really matter. It wouldn't matter if you're using a lightweight lens when you're doing something like that. But if you're going to be using this outdoors, you're going to be doing landscape photography, for example, travel photography, street photography, this being compact and this being lightweight can actually also be beneficial. Now, in the Air series, the build is also very minimalistic. There are, of course, an abundance of plastic elements right here. I wouldn't expect this to be weather sealed. Again, we're talking about a budget lens. There's only one big focus ring. There is no AF/MF switch, so you're gonna have to do that on the body. There is nothing else. There's no focus hold button. There's no customizable button. There is, however, that USB-C port that you can use to update the firmware if that will be available. But as far as the barrel goes, the only thing we have there is the label that says AF 14mm f4 FE, the logo of Viltrox, that QR code and all of those logos, and this focus ring right here. Of course, there's no zoom ring, it's a prime lens. And then when we look at the front element, you can see that the reason why they were able to make it this small, even though it's a wide angle 14mm lens, is because the front element is still bulbous, but it is kind of contained within that last layer of the barrel, which means that even though it is bulbous, it is kind of retracted into the barrel and it's not protruding. Technically, all of that fits right within the barrel, so you don't even really feel that there is a bulbous front element. Now, another great thing about that is, of course, there is a filter thread. And another thing I've said about the Air series lenses of Viltrox is that even though the lenses are tiny, they at least make sure that the filter threads are within standard ranges, which means that it's not 40, it's not 40.3 or something that ridiculous. It's not even 52, it's 58, which for me is a great thing. When I was starting photography, the standard filter sizes for kit lenses was 58, and this was during the Canon EOS 400D days. So it's nice to see that the filter size, even though this is technically a smaller lens, remains like that, because those are the sizes that are more available in the market. So even if it's a small lens, they made a slightly bigger filter thread so that it's more compatible. Now, I don't really have a 58mm filter, but I do have this, and it's a magnetic adapter for my HNY Evo series filters. And of course, that mounts onto that, and then this can be just magnetically attached. And if in fact I want to use more filters, and I can stack them easily with the magnets, and that's going to be very easy. There's not even going to be a vignette because I'm using a bigger filter. But I did test it out with 58mm filters, and since again it's already bigger than the barrel size, you don't really get that vignette unless you're stacking maybe around 4 filters already. So even just the fact that you can use standard size filters on a 14mm is really good. Of course, it's a wide angle. It's something very much usable for landscape photography, especially if you're in a budget. And when it comes to the optics, I of course tested for 2 things. Number 1 is the sharpest aperture, and number 2, the distortion. Off the bat, I found the best optical performance when it comes to the center of the frame at f5.6. And when it comes to the corners, everything was sharper at f8. But again, the center was way better at f5.6. And then anything past f11, well, there was degradation. Now, I wouldn't say this is a very, very sharp lens, but I would say it's sharp enough. And especially considering that it costs just $200, then there's really not much to ask for when it comes to that. If you're looking for G Master level optics, well, you're not gonna get that out of a $200 14mm budget prime. But considering that it is just $200, you're actually getting more sharpness than what you usually would for that price. Now, more importantly, the first thing I tested when I got this lens, in fact, literally when I got this lens, I opened the box, mounted it on my camera, and just looked at the viewfinder just to see. And that is distortion. Now, I wouldn't call this a zero distortion lens, but I would say that most people will not be able to identify the distortion. There's a slight barrel distortion that I would say I'm pretty okay with, considering the size of this lens and the price of this lens. And again, probably if you're not an architectural photographer, you wouldn't even notice it. Now, if you do want to correct that very minimal distortion, it's very easy to do that in post. And since you're using a 14mm, then you're probably gonna have a lot of room to work with anyway. But yes, the distortion is very minimal, very natural. Most people will not even see it. And that is why I think, as I said at the start of this video, this could be very transformational for someone who is just starting out. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you're, for example, a beginner who just decided that you want to shoot architecture or you want to shoot interiors, real estate, especially if you're going to be shooting tight spaces, say small businesses or small Airbnbs, this lens is going to be very helpful because it's 14mm. It's going to get you through a lot of the tight spaces that you might have to encounter, and it has decent optics, and it has very minimal distortion, which means that technically, if you're starting out and you're beginning to be a professional in terms of real estate and interiors, this is going to be very, very usable. And really, I appreciate that because not everyone who is potentially good for whatever genre is going to have a lot of money to start out. And hopefully this lens can find its way to someone who is just starting out but is very promising when it comes to artistic vision and, the eyes for the angles for shooting interiors. And it's going to be really helpful. And in fact, it could be the first thing they get and the last thing they upgrade until they could, say, afford a shift lens or a tilt shift lens or something like that. But for anyone who is on a budget, this is definitely usable for architecture pertaining to shooting wide spaces. And of course, also for shooting interiors. Now, of course, it's not the only use case. Again, I already said you can technically use this for landscape photography, specifically anything with nice foreground elements, and you're at f4, you can stop it down to f8, f11, no problem. Use it with filters, no problem. I wasn't able to test that out because this hasn't been with me for longer than 2 weeks, but that's totally fine. What I did do when I got this was, I went about my regular day. It was my day off. I went to the mall, had some coffee, and wanted to shoot some interiors of the coffee shop, and I was able to do it. And then later I stepped out and I saw that there was a bit of sun outside, so I can shoot some street and be able to look for shadows. Now, I like shooting street photography with wide angle lenses, and it took me a little while to realize why, but definitely it's because I like it when there is a person in frame and the sun is of course out and then the person is casting a shadow. The wide angle perspective is of course going to stretch that shadow out, and it's going to give you a very dynamic composition. I wouldn't say that the photos I was able to take with this are any of my best, but I would say that it is definitely usable, and I am considering taking it out for more spins out in the street because I enjoyed shooting with a 14mm. And it's also really nice to use when shooting street because technically I would just go from f4 to maybe f8 at the most with this lens because I don't want everything in full detail whenever I'm shooting street anyway. So that's going to fall within the sharper apertures of this lens, and that's going to be really good. For interiors, f8 is going to have to be enough, and technically you can do with that. Now, honestly, this is supposed to be just an initial impression because technically, again, I haven't had this for more than 2 weeks, and I usually test lenses for at least a month. But there's already a lot to say because, it's not just the optics, it's not just the physical attributes of the lens, but the entire context. Again, I think the biggest thing about this is that it's going to be very empowering for someone who is on a budget, who is starting out, but needs a wide angle lens they can use, and a wide angle lens that is decent and reliable. Yes, there we go. This is again the Viltrox 14mm f4 Air for full frame mirrorless cameras. And if you have any questions about this lens, then you can of course leave them down below in the comment section. And as I said, if you're new to the channel, my name is Nicco Valenzuela. I'm a landscape and architectural photographer. From time to time, I like shooting street. That said, if you are into any content about photography and the gear that I use, then that's the content that I do. And you can click the subscribe button and hit that notification bell. In any case, thank you for being here and thank you for watching.